Hello everyone and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story name: The Drowning Clock. The first time I saw the clock, it wasn't ticking. It wasn't doing much of anything, really, just sitting there in the corner of my late grandmother's attic, covered in a thin film of dust and the kind of dread you can't explain but can always feel. It was old, maybe older than the house itself, its dark wood casing cracked and warped from years of neglect. The pendulum hung frozen, like a heart that had given up beating a long time ago. I didn't like looking at it, but I couldn't help myself. There was something about the clock that demanded your attention. It wasn't just the way the gold hands gleamed faintly in the dim attic light or the intricate carvings on its face that seemed to shift if you stared too long. No, it was something deeper, something alive. "Don't touch it," my mom said from the doorway, her voice sharp enough to snap me out of whatever spell I was under. She was carrying a box labeled Old Photos in black marker, her hands trembling ever so slightly. I hadn't seen her this tense since the funeral. "It's just a clock," I said, even though I didn't believe it. She gave me a look, the kind that said she wasn't in the mood for an argument. "Leave it alone, Sam. That thing's been nothing but trouble." Trouble? It was a clock, for crying out loud. But something in her voice, the crackle of fear just beneath the surface, made me back off. For now. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that creeps up on you when you're alone in a place too big for one person. My mom had gone to bed early, the stress of sorting through Grandma's things weighing her down. I was in the guest room, lying on my back and staring at the ceiling, but all I could see was the clock. It wasn't just sitting there anymore, in my mind's eye. It was ticking. The sound was faint at first, a soft tick-tock like the beating of a distant drum. But it grew louder with every passing second, until it was the only thing I could hear. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The house was still silent, but I could swear I heard water dripping. I told myself it was just my imagination, the residue of a long day in a house full of memories. But the sound wouldn't go away. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, the steady drip, drip, drip of water coming from somewhere it shouldn't. I followed it, down the creaking stairs, through the darkened living room, and up to the attic door. My hand hovered over the knob for a moment, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn around, to go back to bed and pretend I'd heard nothing. But curiosity is a powerful thing, isn't it? The attic was colder than it should have been, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like you're standing at the edge of a grave. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered as I stepped inside, casting long, twisted shadows across the room. And there it was. The clock. Only now it was ticking. The pendulum swung back and forth with a slow, deliberate rhythm, and the gold hands were moving. But the strangest thing was the water. It was leaking out from behind the clock's face, trickling down its carved edges and pooling on the floor beneath it. The sound of it, the drip, 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 was louder now, almost deafening. I should have run. I should have turned around, locked the attic door, and never gone back. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped closer. The air around the clock felt heavy, thick like a storm was about to break. My reflection stared back at me from the glass covering the clock face, but it wasn't right. The eyes weren't mine. They were sunken, hollow, like they belonged to someone who hadn't seen the sun in years. The skin was pale and damp, and there were faint ripples in the glass, as though I was looking at myself through water. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and touched the glass. It was cold, ice cold, and then it cracked. Not just the glass, the world. The air itself seemed to shatter, and I was falling, drowning, the attic disappearing around me in a blur of dark water and muffled screams. I couldn't breathe, couldn't see, couldn't think. The only thing I could hear was the relentless ticking of the clock, louder and faster now, echoing in my head like a countdown. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I was back in the attic, gasping for air, my hands and knees soaked with icy water. The clock stood silent again, its pendulum still, its face dark. The pool of water on the floor was gone, as though it had never been there. But something had changed. I could feel it. The next morning, I told my mom what had happened. She didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked resigned, like she'd been waiting for this moment. "That clock's been in our family for generations," she said, her voice heavy with something I couldn't quite place. "It's not just a clock, Sam. It's a doorway." "A doorway to what?" I asked, my mouth dry. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. That night, the ticking came back. Only this time, it didn't stop. And neither did the water. It started with a drip, then a trickle, then a flood. No matter how many towels I used, no matter how many times I checked the pipes, the water kept coming. It was cold and dark, and it smelled like the ocean, like salt and decay and things better left buried. The clock was awake now, and it wanted something. No, not something. Someone. I didn't sleep for days, too afraid of what might happen if I closed my eyes. The ticking followed me everywhere, a constant reminder that time was running out. And the reflection in the clock's glass, my reflection, looked less and less like me every time I saw it. The water rose higher, flooding the house inch by inch, until it reached my knees. My mom begged me to leave, but I couldn't. The clock wouldn't let me. On the last night, the water reached the ceiling. I stood in the attic, the cold biting into my skin, the clock ticking louder than ever. The pendulum swung faster, the gold hands spinning wildly, and the face of the clock began to glow, casting the room in a sickly green light. And then I saw them. The figures in the water. Dozens of them, their faces pale and bloated, their eyes empty sockets. They reached for me with skeletal hands, their mouths moving in silent screams. The clock struck midnight, and the water surged forward, pulling me under. The last thing I saw was my reflection in the glass, smiling as the world went dark. I don't know how I'm still here, writing this. Maybe I'm not. Maybe this is just another trick of the clock, another echo trapped in its endless ticking. But if you ever find it, if you ever hear the ticking or see the water, run. Don't look back. Because the drowning clock doesn't just keep time. It takes it. And sooner or later, it'll take you too. I woke up gasping, my lungs burning like I'd been held underwater for hours. But I wasn't in the attic anymore, or at least I didn't think I was. The room around me was dark, impossibly dark, as though light had been swallowed whole. The air was heavy, damp, and cold, and the smell of salt and rot was everywhere. The ticking was still there, louder now. It seemed to come from every direction, like the walls themselves were alive with it. I tried to stand, but my legs felt weak, like they didn't belong to me anymore. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. It echoed back, warped and distant, as though the darkness itself was mocking me. And then I saw it, the faint, greenish glow of the clock's face. It floated in the distance, the hands spinning wildly, the pendulum swinging faster and faster. The water around it rippled, even though there was no breeze, no movement. I stumbled toward it, the sound of my footsteps splashing in shallow water that seemed to stretch forever. My breath came in ragged gasps as I drew closer, and that's when I saw the faces. They were everywhere, just beneath the surface of the water. Pale, lifeless faces with sunken eyes and mouths that hung open as though they were still screaming. I recognized some of them. The man from the tape, a little girl in a torn dress, an old woman with stringy hair. And there were more. Too many to count. The water rippled again, and one of the faces turned to look at me. Its mouth moved, and though no sound came out, I understood. "Help us," it mouthed, the words hanging in the air like smoke. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I wanted to run, but where would I go? There was nothing but darkness all around me, and the clock was the only point of light. The voice came next. Not the same voice as before. This one was deeper, colder, and it echoed through the darkness like thunder. "You can't save them," it said. "You can't even save yourself." The water began to rise, slowly at first, then faster. It crept up my legs, cold as death, pulling at me with invisible hands. I tried to fight it, but the harder I struggled, the stronger it became. The faces in the water began to move, their mouths opening and closing, their hands reaching up toward me. The air was filled with whispers now, all of them pleading, all of them desperate. "Help us. Save us. Don't leave us." The clock's glow grew brighter, and I could see the carvings on its face more clearly now. They weren't just decorative, they were symbols. Ancient, intricate symbols that seemed to shift and writhe as I stared at them. The water was at my chest now, the cold biting into my skin like knives. I reached for the clock, my fingers trembling, and as soon as I touched it, the world shifted again. I was no longer in the water. I was standing in a room, a grand, decaying ballroom with walls that oozed black sludge and chandeliers that hung at odd angles, their crystals coated in dust. The clock stood in the center, its face glowing brighter than ever, its pendulum swinging so fast it was a blur. The figures were there too. They stood in a circle around the clock, their bodies broken and twisted, their eyes hollow and black. They stared at me, their mouths moving in unison, chanting words I couldn't understand. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The deep voice came again, this time from everywhere and nowhere. "We want time," it said. "And now, so do you." The figures moved closer, their hands reaching out for me, their whispers growing louder, more urgent. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The clock struck 12, and everything stopped. The figures froze, the air went still, and the pendulum came to an abrupt halt. Then, with a deafening crack, the clock split open. Inside, there was nothing but darkness, a swirling void that seemed to pull everything toward it. The figures were the first to go, dragged into the void one by one, their screams echoing through the ballroom. The water returned, flooding the room in seconds, and I felt it pulling at me, dragging me toward the clock. I fought with everything I had, clawing at the floor, but it was no use. The pull was too strong. As I was dragged closer, I saw my reflection in the clock's face. It wasn't me anymore. It was something else, Something older, something darker. Its eyes were empty, its mouth twisted into a cruel smile. "You're part of it now," the reflection said, its voice cold and final. The void swallowed me whole. If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know. You might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here the darkness is always waiting just for you.